Well, thank you all for coming. So this is my presentation. I entitled it Special Education, the School to Prison Pipeline, and the Answer of Critical Pedagogy. And here it is. I want to start with a story about this man, Robert Ladd. Robert Ladd died January 29th, 2015. He was convicted for the murder of Vicki Ann Garner. There's no doubt that he committed a crime, a bad one, and that he did this crime. There's no doubt. The state of Texas gave him capital punishment in 2015. In 1970, when Robert was 12 years old, a psychiatrist found that his IQ was around 67. 70 is considered intellectually disabled. The Supreme Court of the United States had previously declared that the execution of a person with disabilities violates their Eighth Amendment right, protecting them against cruel and unusual punishment, but that did not stop Robert's sentence. Brian Stahl is a lawyer with the American Civil Liberties Union, and he says that Ladd's deficits are well documented, debilitating, and significant. On his last day, he apologized to the family of Vicki Ann Garner, saying that he was really, really sorry. And in his last words, he complained about the stinging in his arm from the lethal injection, which for me begs the question, did he really understand the fully what was going on? 3 months before he died, he wrote a 6-paragraph letter at elementary school level detailing some of his experiences in life. He described struggling in school at an early age. In 1995, he was released from prison for lesser crimes, and he was sent to a work center for what he called mentally retarded workers who were paid less than minimum wage. That was approved by the U.S. Department of Labor due to special circumstances. Robert's case is an extreme one, but it is not an isolated one. Death Penalty Focus is a nonprofit group that looks at alternatives to capital punishment. And they report that since 1983, over 60 people with mental illness or intellectual disability have been executed in the United States. They also report numbers from the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimating that in 1998, 283,000 mentally ill were incarcerated in U.S. jails and prisons. Our problem is called the school-to-prison pipeline. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but they have 25% of the world's prisoners, much more than any other country. The American Civil Liberties Union says that the school-to-prison pipeline refers to the prioritization of incarceration over education. So if you think just about our state of California, since 1980, the state of California has built 22 prisons and 1 university. There are a lot of factors leading into this. So school shootings is something that we are aware of, and that has definitely changed the landscape and changed the way schools handle discipline. But also zero tolerance policies, incentives to hide poor performing students, and the growing presence of law enforcement, probation officers, drug dogs, and metal detectors on public school campuses. Rates of suspension have increased dramatically in recent years from 1.7 million in 1974 to 3 million in 2000. And they have been most dramatic for children of color. It's probably important for us to realize at this point that public schools are meant to be a public utility, something that is available to all, while prisons are a for-profit venture. When I was working not too long ago in a group home, we were watching, one day we were home from school, me and the students, and we were watching game shows, as people do, stay home during the day. And Bob Barker came on the screen. He's the the host of The Price is Right. And one of my students said, "Bob Barker, I know that guy." And I said, "Yeah, you watch The Price is Right?" He said, "No, my shoes were made by Bob Barker." And I'd never heard that Bob Barker was in the business of making shoes, but he told me about Bob Barker's other work. And you may have never heard this tagline, but Bob Barker calls himself America's leading detention supplier. And this is actually a picture from his website. The group home I worked at was kind of a halfway house between juvenile hall and getting back into mainstream society. And Bob Barker sells bedding, towels, clothing, maintenance, footwear, mattresses, things for officers, cutlery, all for the prison system. It is big, big money. I was thinking about that student last night as I was kind of preparing this. So here's my research questions. In the school-to-prison pipeline, how significant is the role of students with disabilities? What does it look like? What does their involvement with that pipeline look like? And secondly, what strategies can be used in the classroom to combat the effects of this serious problem? I should tell you right off the bat that I have a few personal biases here. Kind of where this started with me was with my group homework. In 2003, I was an undergrad student here at Azusa Pacific University. I took a semester off, and I got a job at a group home for students with emotional difficulties and disabilities. And from 2005 to 2008, I lived in San Jose as a manager of a halfway house where I met the boy with the Bob Barker shoes, telling me about, there I worked with kids who were dealing with addiction and drugs and alcohol. While I was there in the home, I learned of this concept that addiction is a disease, and that it is something that needs to be dealt with, treated, for example. And seeing all my students who had been sort of a part of this corrections culture, had been in and out of juvenile halls and were had family in prison, I started to realize that the war on drugs and putting people in prison for being addicts is kind of like sending the Marines to deal with cancer. It doesn't make any sense to put these people into prison. And so I started to kind of self-reflect on where I was working and who I was working with. Around this time, I started dating Laura. Laura worked at the University of San Francisco. She's now my wife. And she invited me to speak on a panel about prison and what people who are a part of the corrections culture. It was there that I met a philosophy professor who introduced me to this idea of the prison abolition movement. And I may talk about that a little more later, but my belief is a belief that is held by some, although they are more minority, and that is that prison is not the answer to any problem. Prison is a huge problem in and of itself. There are people who believe that prison has really only replaced things like slavery and Jim Crow, and sort of created a space for society's undesirables, and that it really presents a huge problem. Everything from the people who end up there, as I'm going to talk about in my paper, to people making millions and millions of dollars off of it. Sort of the last of my personal biases is, as a Christian, my belief in the Jubilee year. In Luke 4, Jesus gives his first public address. He speaks of the year of the Lord's favor. And the year of the Lord's favor is an Old Testament concept that has to do with the forgiveness of debts and the freeing of prisoners. And we have taken those things into modern Christianity, and we have used them to talk about our debt of sin and the freedom from sort of the prison of our minds, which may serve a wonderful place for us in our spirituality. But I do believe wholeheartedly that Jesus and the Old Testament prophets did not mean those to be sort of abstract concepts in our brain, but that they meant them as the actual freedom from debts and the actual freeing of prisoners. So that's another of my personal biases. As my paper is a literature review, so I looked at the literature surrounding the school-to-prison pipeline, and I focused on 3 areas. Evidence of disability in the pipeline. I wanted to see where students with disabilities sort of fall in these categories. And then I also wanted to look at the role of stigmatization, what role that plays, not only for students with disabilities, but also for students in corrections. And then lastly, critical pedagogy, which from my title is sort of the answer, I think, to a lot of these problems we face. So let's talk about evidence of disability in the school-to-prison pipeline. Mazzotti and Higgins, they highlight class, gender, age, and ethnicity factors that come into play when students from public schools come into contact with the juvenile justice system. And along with those important factors, they note the high rate of students with disabilities in the system. They did a study of juvenile offenders and found that 70 to 90% have emotional behavioral disorders. That's obvious, right? They've clearly committed some crime to end up there. 53% have learning disabilities. 46% have attention deficit disorder. 13% have intellectual disabilities, which we used to call mentally retarded. And they show that about 65% show signs of depression and 41% show signs of anxiety disorders. Obviously, those are overlapping statistics. We know that students of color are entered into special education at a higher rate than white students. And we also know that people of color have a higher likelihood of ending up in the prison system. And I don't think that there's a coincidence there in those statistics. Mazzotti and Higgins also looked at the workers who work in juvenile hall facilities, and they found that less than half had actually been trained on what a disability is or how it could affect their clientele. So when we teach, we work with students who have, say, for example, difficulty with auditory processing. So if I say, hey, get up out of your seat, get your book, go sit down, well, that's too much for them. I need to sort of give them step by step. If these people in juvenile hall have not been trained on these issues, then they would not understand what an auditory processing disorder is, and it would only create more conflict within the juvenile system. So it is problematic that less than half have been trained. Harry Wilson, the National Network for Youth, he's also the co-founder of the Federal Mentoring Council, describes the problem of the school-to-prison pipeline and its effects on students who do not fit into the public school mold. He says the United States has become a culture of incarceration, removing from society people who present difficult problems, including conditions caused by disability and addiction. The second area that I wanted to look into with my literature review is the role of stigmatization. And when I was searching art for my presentation, there was a series of images that I chose not to include because they were too graphic. They were pictures taken from around the world, and they were of prisoners or slaves who had been in chains long enough that the chains had sort of it was hard to tell where some of the chains began and the person's actual body began. They had been in chains long enough. And I think that's a perfect metaphor for what stigmatization is and what it does to our students. Again, from Mazzotti and Higgins, their 2006 article called Public School and the Juvenile Justice System. They point out that students returning from placement can often be labeled by their peers, which creates a cycle of feelings of hopelessness that only leads to further problems for a young adult. Nancy Iseland wrote a fantastic book. If you are a Christian, she wrote a book called The Disabled God. And it is a book for people who work with disabilities. And in it, she talks about the psychologist John Goffman and sort of the way he discussed stigmatization. Irving Goffman. She notes, people like actors on a stage manage social cues to create and sustain an impression of who they are and what they are doing all the time. Some people, however, are cast in roles that constrain their capacity to manage positive impressions of themselves, and these people are stigmatized. That is, they are marked as bearers of what Goffman identified as a spoiled identity. And those of us who teach in special needs classroom see that every day. We see students who can't sort of move beyond their disability or what we have said is their sort of mark. Students who experience stigmatization in high school, David Kinney argues, have a difficult time forming their own identities. And in the case of the school-to-prison pipeline, we have students building sort of dual negative stigmatization. So they're labeled as special needs, and they're labeled as being in corrections, and it's just sort of compounded problems on top of problems. This quote from Link and Sterling talks about the connection between stigmas and mental illness. People develop conceptions of mental illness early in life from family lore, personal experience, peer relations, and the media's portrayal of people with mental illnesses. On the basis of these conceptions, people form expectations about whether most people will reject an individual who has mental illness as a friend, an employee, a neighbor, or an intimate partner, and whether most people will devalue a person who has a mental illness as being less trustworthy, less intelligent, and less competent. And in my experience, that is also true of students who feel like their only place is in special education. Oftentimes, they'll refer to other students in their school as regular students or regular classes, and I'm always trying to remind them there is no regular student, right? We're all very abnormal. Jean Vanier is a Christian philosopher who started the L'Arche movement, L'Arche homes for people with special needs. And in his book, Community and Growth, he says, in community life, we discover our own deepest wound and learn to accept it so our birth can begin. And it is from this very wound that we are reborn. And I would say that is the essence right there of Christianity, that from our wounds we are reborn. The problem, of course, is that we have a society that wants to normalize everything, that wants everybody to look the same. High-stakes testing, right, wants everybody to fit into this bubble. And if you don't fit into that world of high-stakes testing, then there is not a place for you. McNulty and Roseborough write, public schools in the United States are predicated upon some common, albeit contested, understanding of a normal child. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, who was also a harsh critic of the prison system in France, said that when there's a regular network of knowledge and power established, so when we start to say that this is what knowledge and power and independence looks like, that's when we start to also classify abnormal individuals. And again, we see that happen all the time with our students with special needs. So what is the answer to this problem? You know, I started out my paper kind of wanting to get at the big questions. I wanted to know sort of what could be done to stop this wave that I've described. What can we do to, for example, abolish prisons, abolish the school-to-prison pipeline? How can we keep our students out of prison? And I don't know if I have those kinds of answers. But what I've found are answers for myself as a classroom teacher who daily meets with students who may find themselves struggling with identity, struggling with stigmatization, who may find themselves at various levels of corrections. And I came across, or I remembered Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a powerful figure in education. People are still, dealing with him, still learning how to apply his methods. His most famous work from 1970 is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he reminds us that those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. And I think that's what this paper did for me. It helped me to re-examine myself and sort of my methods of teaching. Famously, Paulo Freire attacked what he called the banking system of education. And I remind my students every day, I am not here to be your banker. In other words, I am not here to open up your brain and deposit knowledge into it so that you can just move on, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue, etc. Rather, I'm there to sort of help them understand education as the practice of freedom, which is what Paulo would say. The critical pedagogy, I kind of broke it down into 3 principles that I think are helpful for us at this point, especially dealing with the students that we deal with. Number 1, very important, students are subjects. They are not objects. Number 2, there is no outside of the norm. And 3, problem-posing education. So, number 1, students are subjects, not objects. It's important that we get away from the mindset of education as something that is done to a young person, rather than something that they participate in. Getting student buy-in is so important. One of the best places that we can do this for our students with special needs is in their IEP process, which takes place every year, and in the transition process, which takes place once they turn 15, sort of preparing them for life after high school. It would be easy to sort of push paper in this area and mark all the boxes and get all the signatures and file the paperwork away and be done with it for the year. But if we are not inviting the students and their families into this process, then we are missing out on sort of the most important part, right? I mean, the I in IEP stands for individual, and they are the individual, and they need to take part in this sort of process of education. So the students are subjects, not objects, and they need to be given the opportunity to buy in, so to speak. For example, the Los Angeles Unified School District designed a pamphlet insisting that student involvement is the most important part of transition planning. And in 2012, they sort of laid out what they considered were the practical roles for a student to participate in. For example, they asked that students take an active role in the IEP meeting by asking questions or even leading the IEP meeting themselves, if that's possible. Helping students find out about local resources and services, helping them get additional work experience. On that note, for my classes this year on back to school night, I teach high school, so it may be a little different if you teach elementary, but I told the parents at back to school night that I would not be giving any homework this year at all. And the kids applauded until they heard what I had in mind, and that was for them to go get a job, or for them to volunteer, or for them to help out at home, or for them to participate in a local church or a local Boys and Girls Club, right? Those are life experiences. I tell my students that nobody has ever asked me since I graduated high school about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? Nobody has asked me about that, right? But what is expected of me is that I know how to behave in society, that I know how to get along with people who are not like me, that I know how to communicate my feelings to other people. The second principle is that there is no outside. And this is kind of a simple concept, in my opinion, but it's that sort of concept that our students refer to when they talk about the regular people or the regular students, or we're not like other students, we're special, and they use special as a derogatory term. It's pulling people in from the margins. And this is why I really do advocate for inclusivity in our classrooms. I think that including special needs children with the general population not only does a lot for those special needs students, but it does a lot for the general population as well. The last principle of critical pedagogy for my paper is the idea of a problem-posing education. The Marshall Project is a nonprofit news organization that focuses on the American criminal justice system. And they interviewed an 18-year-old student last year from Jackson, Mississippi. And he had this to say. He said, "I wouldn't say I was a smart aleck, but I was known for speaking up." He recalls asking why a lot, like why the pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb wasn't considered the worst murderer of all time, and praising Karl Marx during history class. By Rock's own description, he is curious by nature. He's always thinking, always speaking up. Teachers either loved me or hated me. Often teachers will see a student like this as problematic, right? He's distracting from the lesson. While Paulo Freire would say, no, this student needs to be the center of your classroom. The student who is willing to ask hard questions. The student who is willing to praise Karl Marx. And you are supposed to draw out from them reasons why they feel that way. You should let that student teach other students, not because you want to spread Karl Marx to all the other students, but because you want the other students to ask questions as well and to challenge one another. This is bringing people in from the outside, and it is allowing the problems in your classroom to solve themselves. That is the real important lesson that students get out of critical pedagogy, is allowing them to solve problems on their own. This idea of problem-posing education has really been reflected also in the study of behavior. So Dr. Ross Greene is a child psychologist and a founder of the nonprofit Lives in the Balance. And he sort of poses that we look at behavior a different way. Behavior has often been dealt with as a sort of sacrificing long-term goals for short-term gain. So we want peace in the classroom, so we want to remove the problem child. But that doesn't do anything for the student who's causing the problem. All it really does is allow the other students to get back to that banking model, right? We can't get the information in their heads if there's a distraction in the classroom. Dr. Ross Greene's model calls for time. It calls for mentorship of students who have problems in the classroom. Studies suggest that he's right, that sort of these removing students from the classroom isn't helping those students. In fact, they're the ones ending up in the school-to-prison pipeline because we want our classrooms to be peaceful places. One school reports, before Greene's program was put in place, conventional discipline at Central was the norm. And during the 2009-2010 school year, kids were referred to the principal's office for discipline 146 times, and 2 were suspended. 2 years later, after putting Dr. Greene's programs into place, the number of referrals was down to 45, so it was down by 66%, with 0 suspensions for the year, all thanks to focusing more on meeting child's needs and solving problems instead of controlling behavior. Trying to control behavior doesn't work, while solving problems does work. One of Paulo Freire's sort of biggest disciples is the writer Bell Hooks, and she is a force of her own. She's written about democracy and education and feminism, and she had this to say about school. The academy is not a paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all of its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education, is the practice of freedom. And facing reality, I think, is really one of the issues that's at hand. Dr. Greene's model of helping students work through their own problems is a way to face reality rather than remove students from the situation and sort of pretend like their problems don't exist anymore. I would say the same thing of what I talked about earlier in the year of Jubilee. Rather than sort of create an abstract idea of freedom, that we actually free people from their actual chains. And the same thing has been done to Paulo Freire and his work. Rather than talk about education, Paulo Freire said that education is the practice of freedom, and we often take that as like the freedom of the mind. But I think Paulo Freire, working in the slums of Brazil, meant no, it is the practice of the actual freedom of actual human bodies. Kind of to close, John Dewey said that democracy has to be reborn and education is its midwife. And the school-to-prison pipeline is sort of a problem in democracy. And real education, critical pedagogy, is, I believe, sort of the answer to that. Lastly, we were asked to do a word cloud of our paper, and this is what came up with my word cloud. I like this, sort of 3 reasons I really like this. Students is central. I like that made it into the very center. I didn't place that there, it just came out number 1. In critical pedagogy, in the work of Paulo Freire, students are central. It is meant to be a student-centered classroom, not a teacher-centered classroom. I also like the fact that prison is off to the side and almost upside down. Because prison, again, is not an answer. It's a problem. And we need to look that reality in the face, especially having 25% of the world's prisoners in our land of the free here. Lastly, I like that Paulo Freire made it into the final result. It's kind of without him, without his writing, I would not have started this journey, and I'm really thankful to be on it and sort of what it represents for me and my students, and potentially future work, teaching in public schools, possibly teaching in prisons, and whatnot. So that's my presentation. So thank you so much.
And let's take a few minutes and see, does anybody have a question?